Hey everyone, and welcome back to today's Explainer. We are diving into a really critical and frankly often misunderstood era of U.S. history: Indian removal and indigenous resistance. We're going to unpack federal and state policy, forced removal, legal conflict, and sheer survival. And we're going to do it by looking at specific native nations, rather than treating indigenous peoples as just one single uniform group. Okay, here's our roadmap for today. We've got post-revolution land claims, resistance in the Northwest, the Indian Removal Act, legal battles and removal, and finally, expansion and indigenous survival. This is going to give us a really clear chronological cause and effect path to help us understand how westward expansion triggered organized responses from various native nations.
All right, Section 1, Post-Revolution Land Claims. Let's rewind right to the end of the American Revolution, because this period really laid the groundwork for decades of conflict over sovereignty.
Just thinking about the sheer speed of U.S. westward expansion is wild. From the 1783 Treaty of Paris all the way up to the 1848 Mexican Cession, the map of the United States was literally transforming overnight. But to really understand this history, we have to recognize that the indigenous response to all these events was absolutely not a monolith.
We really have to shatter this myth of a single native group. These were entirely distinct nations, and they employed vastly different strategies to survive. You've got the Mohawk focusing on diplomatic and territorial resistance, while the Creek were building strategic alliances. Then you have the Cherokee taking the fight straight into U.S. courts, and the Western Confederacy organizing heavy military defense. Every single nation assessed their own unique situation and responded in their own way.
So to grasp the roots of these conflicts, we gotta separate the claims from the actual historical evidence. After the Revolutionary War, the U.S. claimed legal ownership of massive Western territories through the 1783 Treaty of Paris, basically arguing they were acquiring British-owned regions. But the historical evidence tells a totally different story. These were sovereign indigenous lands. Native Americans were completely left out of those treaties, and the British simply broke their promises to help protect their native allies' territory. Which brings us to the leaders who actually stood up against these illegal claims. Take Joseph Brant, for instance, whose given name was Thayendanegea. He was a highly prominent Mohawk leader who had allied with the British during the Revolution. Now, that alliance made the post-war landscape incredibly complicated. Operating from his home on the shores of Lake Ontario and Canada, Brant's efforts really highlight the intense, on-the-ground diplomatic and physical resistance to white encroachment onto native lands.
Moving on to Section 2, Resistance in the Northwest. Because these territorial disputes didn't just quietly stay in courtrooms or treaty negotiations, they quickly boiled over into direct military conflict. As tensions inevitably erupted into the War of 1812, a massive struggle was playing out on the frontier. The British were actually arming their native allies against the United States. And right in the middle of this, Tecumseh emerges as a crucial figure. He achieved something truly monumental. He organized the Western Confederacy, leading native peoples from multiple different nations in a unified, powerful military defense of their contested lands in the Northwest.
Okay, time for a quick pause check to make sure we're connecting the dots here. Think about the cause and effect. Why did the Western Confederacy's defeat in the War of 1812 profoundly impact U.S. westward expansion? So the immediate reasoning is this. Losing the war meant losing their leader, Tecumseh, who was killed in battle. And that wasn't just losing a general, it was the collapse of a unifying vision. That defeat shattered their organized military defense of those contested lands. Without that unified pushback, the region was left completely wide open to an unprecedented surge of U.S. expansion.
And that brings us to Section 3, the Indian Removal Act. That massive surge of expansionism directly fueled the really harsh domestic policies of the 1830s, specifically under Andrew Jackson.
Now, this whole path to relocation didn't just happen overnight. First, popular culture in the age of Jackson really started emphasizing this idea of perceived savagery, causing public animosity toward native peoples to skyrocket. That cultural shift found its legal teeth when Congress passed the Indian Removal Act in 1830. But here's the crazy part. In the middle of all this, the Cherokee actually won their case in the U.S. Supreme Court. And yet the end result was still the U.S. military forcibly removing the native nations of the Southeast from their ancestral homes anyway.
Let's dig into that in Section 4, Legal Battles and Removal, because that Supreme Court victory represents an incredible pivot in resistance strategies.
Unlike the military resistance we saw earlier with the Western Confederacy, the Cherokee Nation tried a totally different playbook. They chose to fight forced removal by using the U.S. legal system against the U.S. government itself. And you know what? It worked. In the landmark case Worcester v. Georgia, they successfully won a ruling in their favor at the U.S. Supreme Court, which legally affirmed their rights against the state of Georgia.
All right, time for our second pause check. Really think about this one. If the Cherokee proved their sovereignty and actually won in the highest court in the land, why on earth were they still removed from their homes? The immediate answer comes down to the sheer stubborn force of political will and public prejudice. You had this deeply entrenched popular animosity and cultural views of quote-unquote savagery. Combine that with the immense political momentum of the 1830 Indian Removal Act, and it empowered the executive branch to basically just ignore the rule of law. It's a truly shocking historical moment. The judicial ruling offered no actual physical protection, and the U.S. military was deployed to carry out the forced removal of these native nations anyway.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, Expansion and Indigenous Survival. Because as the 19th century rolled on, this pattern of displacement didn't stop.
In fact, it accelerated. By 1848, the Mexican Cession added nearly half of Mexico's territory to the U.S., and that was immediately followed by the California Gold Rush. This pulled hundreds of thousands of settlers out west. Now, this rapid population explosion led to a massive, truly heartbreaking loss of Native American life in the West. But, and this is absolutely vital to remember, despite these catastrophic losses and relentless systemic pressures, indigenous nations adapted, they resisted, and they survived.
Let's bring it all together with a concise recap. The biggest takeaway from today's explainer is that indigenous history is not just some simple story of passive victimhood. It's a history of complex, incredibly varied resistance. These nations were never a monolith. They used diplomacy, the court system, and organized combat to defend their homes. Second, U.S. claims to westward expansion frequently contradicted the actual historical evidence of native sovereignty. And lastly, overwhelming federal policies and military force drove systematic, forced removal, even when native nations won clear-cut legal victories.
So, I'm going to leave you with this transfer question to chew on. How does understanding the U.S. government's past actions regarding indigenous lands help us analyze modern debates over land use, sovereignty, and resources? It's a huge question because this history isn't just in the past, it's the very foundation of the debates we're still having today. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I'll catch you next time.